Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 151st episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And as you know, July is all about looking at lived experiences, what they mean and how they shape the world around us. And to join me today is the amazing Maya Goodfellow. She's an author, academic and broadcaster, specialising in the relationships between race, bordering and capitalism. Ideal for the show, right? She's currently a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Sheffield. And her first book, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, was published with Verso in 2019 and was longlisted for the Jhalak Prize. Maya received her PhD from SOAS, University of London in 2019, and she has written for The Guardian and the New York Times, among others. And I'm so delighted to have her with us today. So Maya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real honour. And I was saying, I know that you're a very prolific person, so we really value your time. And I've just given a sense of your bio and an overview, but I think it's really nice for listeners to hear more about you and what you do from your perspective.
Yeah, so I guess I do a few things. So like my main role at the moment is I work at Sheffield University as a Leverhulme Research Early Career Research Fellow. And so that really involves doing research, as you might imagine. And so like my day-to-day is, whether it is writing things up, whether it is conducting interviews or doing archival research, but alongside sort of my academic career, I also do bits and pieces of media. So whether that is doing broadcast media, like interviews on the BBC or Sky or Al Jazeera, or whether that is writing. And so I guess with the journalistic side, it's also that research that I'm doing on the academic side, some of that translates through to the journalistic writing that I do. So one of the things I try to do, I'm not sure I'm always successful, is to try and translate some of the things that exist within academia that don't always make it out to like the rest of the world in an accessible way. Try and translate some of that thinking to broader audiences is like what I strive to do, but it's a very difficult thing to do. So I'm not sure I always sort of get that right, but that's how I sort of see those two tracks of my career relating to each other.
Yeah, brilliant. And what was your journey to becoming an academic? So how did you always know that you wanted to be an academic and be in this sort of area of academia?
It's a really good question. And no, I don't think I did. I don't think I did always want to be an academic. I originally thought I was actually going to do journalism full time, I think. So I actually started, after I did a master's, I started in like the think tank world. I had a at the time, rare paid internship in a think tank. And I sort of decided that wasn't for me. I then ended up, was very lucky, sort of got a job at a website that covered news and comment from across the Labour movement. And so I actually reported on the 2015 general election. It felt like one of my jobs was sort of like following Ed Miliband, the then Labour leader, around the country. But whilst I was doing that, I suppose one of the things with that kind of work is you are sort of following the news cycle, and it can feel difficult. And I'm sure this isn't the case for all people who do journalism, because there's all different kinds of journalism out there. But for me, it felt like I didn't have enough time with certain issues or certain subjects to think things through. And, I'm sure a lot of people who are political journalists do that in their spare time or make the time to dive in deep to certain issues. But I just didn't feel like I had that sort of grounding, that academic grounding in like really core issues. So one of the things I work on is thinking a lot about immigration and borders. And I just felt like I didn't have enough knowledge about those subjects. And obviously, like, formal academia is not the only way to learn about these things. Like, there are all kinds of really useful ways of learning about, I don't know, whether it's histories of immigration or whether it's about British capitalism that isn't the academy. But at the time, that seemed like the route for me that seemed sort of the most clear or obvious. And so I did a PhD that was actually in looking at race and racism in British international development. Like, primarily the other reason I ended up doing that was because I'd grown up in a household where like international development was always sort of questioned. And like my mum was born in Uganda, like raised in India for part of her life, and then moved to Britain, and so had this like real still has this real difficulty with the international development and how it's talked about in the public domain. And so one of the reasons I ended up in academia as well is because I had questions about that I suppose I'd been raised to think about, but I didn't have enough knowledge about it. And so it seemed like a good place to go and think about some, big questions. And in a lot of ways, it's a real privilege to be able to have that time to sit and think and learn and write. It wasn't totally planned, but that's kind of how I ended up in the academy, I guess.
Yeah, that's unusual, actually, isn't it? Like you said, you felt you didn't have enough time to explore those subjects in depth or really know your subject. And I think, that's often the problem, isn't it? Like you see reporting headlines. I remember it was a few years ago around adoption. It was not adoption, it was about fostering. And it said that, Muslim children are put into white households. And I thought that's interesting because Muslims can be from any background and any walk of life and any culture. So this kind of things that then insidious and then get woven into our everyday linguistics and language and perspectives. And the fact that you wanted to really get in there to have the facts, I think is so important. Because as you know, journalism is meant to be really robust, and it isn't always. If we pick up certain tabloid papers, we know this is the case.
Yeah, and I guess I suppose it's also useful to say that a lot of academics who I don't know if there's any academics listening to this, is once you're sort of post PhD, it's not necessarily the case that you do have all that time. Like a lot of people are sort of overburdened with teaching and the way that universities are structured now. But yes, certainly it at times feels like, and this can obviously happen in sort of any profession. It can happen in academia too. It's not as if academics are like all knowing individuals. But I often think about the fact that in the not the official version, but like the leaked version of the investigation into the Windrush scandal, the Wendy Williams report. And actually in the final thing as well, there was an iteration of this, and she talked about how it was really important that people who work in the Home Office learn about Britain's colonial history in order to understand like how the so-called Windrush scandal happened. And I remember at the time when that sort of news broke and I was really deep into researching my book, like quite a few politicians seemed to not really know how it was that these people had ended up in this situation, because they had come as citizens or subjects of Britain because of the empire. And for me, that was really telling, because it did show and does show how like what we learn at school, the kind of education we have access to, really shapes the way that we understand the world. And I really believe that actually this kind of like learning and thinking that I've been able to have the space to do should be available to anyone at any sort of stage in their life, because like we're not all knowing, we always have more to learn. And I think that if people could have more space for that, it would make for like much better informed conversations around these massive issues that are like often of public importance, or like of a lot of political debate rather, such as immigration. You'd have a much more like a much better sort of understanding of these subjects, or at least an ability to sort of tussle over them in a way that is maybe better informed than maybe we have at the moment.
Yeah, because there isn't a week that goes by that there's not something in the media related to race, ethnicity, migration, culture. Yeah, so I think we all have a responsibility to learn as well, and to understand and use media as sources of info, but not the gospel, if you like. And in your book, you talk about, you use this term racial capitalism. And I just wondered, what does that term mean to you, and why is it important for us to understand this?
Yeah, another very good question, and I will probably not do justice to anyone listening who also has read a lot about racial capitalism. This is not a definitive sort of understanding, but I guess whether you want to call it racial capitalism, or whether you want to think about whether you want to see it as like thinking about the ways that race can be produced through capitalism, I suppose one of the reasons for thinking about this is that when we talk about race in the public debate, it's often seen as like either historic or contemporary prejudice, like individual people doing bad things. And that happens, obviously that exists. So I wouldn't want to downplay like whether that is violence in the streets, whether that's discrimination at work. I wouldn't want to downplay any of that. But this is racial capitalism, I suppose, provides us, or can provide us with the tools to thinking about how race can be produced through global capitalism. So the fact that we live in a capitalist society. So that doesn't mean like overlooking the way that like other factors can impact the way race is produced. So things like where you are in the world, what point in history you are. Like, it should actually draw attention to like the specificity of the moment. So what I mean by that is racism can change. So talking about racial capitalism doesn't mean there's like one theory of what race is and what racism is, and that is all it ever is, and it's only ever one group of people who are being discriminated against or exposed to vulnerability. But it's about recognizing that race is produced by economic relations. So one of the ways of thinking about that is that there's sort of a train of thought that would say that capitalism sort of homogenizes and turns many people into wage laborers, the people who have to work to live, to have to sell their labor. But one way of really understanding that is actually labor exploitation can develop differently. And so different people can be racialized in different ways and therefore exposed to different kinds of vulnerability. So we could think about the fact, I mean, I would argue, I'm working on this now, so it's maybe not quite so neatly thought through, but I would argue like immigration regimes can do that, right? In that that can divide people into low and high skilled workers, and people who are, depending on what your skill set is deemed to be, you'll be able to have access to certain forms of rights, you'll be able to stay in the country for a particular amount of time. And we could see that as a sort of racializing process. So the fact that it's not only that you might be so-called lower class or poorer, but it's also where you might come from in the world, or how those skills that you have are seen to translate across into a context like Britain. So really, I guess, a long way of saying is that racial capitalism can be a way of thinking about the ways that people who are working class are stratified differently. It's like there's maybe this hierarchy of humanity, and that isn't to say that people who are white, like racialized as white and working class, aren't also exploited, but it's just that exploitation can look different and the intensity of it can be different. I think is one way to think about it. Certainly not the only way to think about it.
Yeah, and of course, Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi talks about that in his book around racialization, and goes back to the kind of commoditization of Black bodies, how that's been the case, and that this whole idea of how native peoples of South America and America were deemed as unfit for labor and slaughtered in mass, and the way that Black people were effectively became African American and were incarcerated in various different ways around there. Yeah, so we could trace it back, and we, like you said, you can move it forward. And there's also a book, and I can't remember who it's by, and I've not read it, but someone mentioned it in a session around how the Irish became white. So looking at you probably read it, the labor in America with Scottish and Irish migrant laborers, and who's deemed white. As we know, there was this whole thing around if you're deemed white, you have access to things. And I think we see it now, don't we? If people are in jobs where they've got access to employee assistance and programs in the workplace versus people that have got to be hidden in kitchens doing dishes, who are more likely to be from global majority backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And just, exactly as you say. And I suppose I should have said, like, right at the start of that, there's like a load of people who've done lots of really good work on this. So Cedric Robinson, the book Black Marxism is generally mentioned when this idea of racial capitalism is talked about. And he was a scholar who is no longer alive, but like did that. I mean, his work goes beyond this sort of the way that I've described racial capitalism. It's more complicated than that. But there's people like Robbie Shilliam who've written about the undeserving poor. There's a whole like range of scholars who are thinking through, and now this idea of like racial capitalism is quite popular. And so I suppose, yeah, we have to be quite specific with how we're using it and how we're thinking about it. And some of the stuff that I'm reading at the moment is also drawing attention to the ways that like the way that race can shift and change, so that who is deemed to be like acceptable and in what ways, or deemed to be exploitable, that can and does. So exactly like you're saying, how like certain groups can become white over time, and how those boundaries of what whiteness is can shift. And I think for me that's quite useful, because it calls attention, like if you're thinking about things like immigration debates, and again, this isn't like something I'm working on at the moment, so it's not fully thought through, but if you're thinking about immigration debates in Britain, for instance, you do have this tension where it is people primarily from, and the new Labour government actually looks towards in the early 2000s, people primarily from Poland, like parts of Eastern Europe. They look to those countries and those people as the people who are going to be the so-called low-skilled laborers. And so that should ask, like, I think forces us to question like what's going on there with race, like how are those people being depicted, and what does that mean for like understanding whiteness. I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I think that the work that you mentioned is all sort of like helps us to think through some of these like questions and issues. And also just to say, like, using terms like low skilled, I obviously don't believe that. Like, these are all constructs of like they sort of give value in that way.
Yeah, so what society deems as low skilled and what society deems as high skilled, but we know now what is considered governmentally as low skilled. We've got fruit rotting in the fields because people don't want to come and pick it. So actually what is quote unquote low skilled, we have a huge carers gap.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I mean, if there was ever going to be a time like the pandemic, right? And it's been said a million times, but like the key workers who's like actually seem to be low skilled, there's like loads of people who were like delivering your food orders, stacking the supermarket shelves, like your delivery driver, like that's will all be sort of dismissed in that way, but are basically doing vital work that keeps everyone alive.
Yeah, and I was talking to DJ Mike Kiss about this, and we were saying how bin collectors actually flipping heck, that's a bloody hard job, and actually not many of us could do it, and how undervalued that is. And if your bin isn't collected, you know about it.
Yeah.
So following on from your book published in 2019, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, what do you think then are the biggest challenges in getting people to understand the devastating impacts that racism creates on mental health, thus creating mental ill health?
Yeah, I guess like with regards to thinking specifically about immigration, which I suppose is what I've like sort of thought the most about on this subject, is that like one of the things to say is I interviewed loads of people for the book who like moved through the immigration system in some way, and so many people I spoke to talked about like the toll that just having to go through all the bureaucracy and like the insecurity of like you're not knowing like what your status is going to be, the potential of being like ripped away from your family, your friends, like your community. One of the things that's like really misleadingly said in the immigration debate is that like immigration, but also like, you know, racial intermixing is sort of one of the, it's often said is, although it's not said in such stark terms, is like bad for so-called integration. Like I would reject that term anyway. These ideas of social cohesion I would reject. But I think it's really telling that actually the immigration system disrupts the sense of community people build because of the ways that it forces people to be moved about, and some people deported, some people, you know, aren't able to live with their children, their friends, their family. So yeah, just there's a lot of understandable distress that is created by the immigration system. And one of the people, I always remember one of the people I interviewed saying like it really feels like it's designed to make you feel like this, and obviously it is, right? The government sent go home bans around people in certain neighborhoods, and all those people I spoke to were certainly way more than their immigration status, and like were resisting in all kinds of ways and had lives beyond trying to navigate the immigration system. But it's just that it did become so all consuming. And I guess in terms of like the challenges, it's like those people are not seen as people. They're so often just sort of the way that it's talked about in the media, the way that it's talked about even in like some academic quarters is like just like numbers on a page. And there's I always remember the late great theorist cultural theorist Stuart Hall saying, you know, as soon as you say a number, it's too many. It's always going to be too many. As soon as you say any number when it comes to immigration rates, it's always going to be too many. And so there's like obviously stitched into all of this is a total stripping away of people's humanity. It's also seen, I think, sometimes as somewhat legitimate to be treating people in quite cruel ways if it means it's going to supposedly weed out the people who should be here and the people who shouldn't be here. So this very extractive idea that, you know, people should only be allowed into the country if they benefit the economy, which I think is a really terrible way to think about any human being. Well, I think some people see the outcomes of the immigration system as like an accident or like a glitch in the system, something that needs to be corrected. But actually, I would argue that these kinds of sort of ways of treating people and this cruelty is embedded into the immigration system. So I think to truly sort of get people to see the impact of things like the immigration system, you really need to understand that it's intentionally designed like that, and any immigration system is going to exclude, and like that is just the reality of it. The sort of metrics by which you exclude it can be altered and changed, but an immigration system is inherently about exclusion. And I suppose that can be quite an unpopular thing to sort of say that you don't agree with, but I don't agree with that. And I guess for me, it's to really get people to understand how much these systems can ruin people's lives is to say, should anyone really be exposed to them in the first place? I would argue not.
Yeah, and I think about the citizenship test, and I just think I don't think many of us would pass that.
Yeah,
They're just ridiculous questions that I've seen. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but yeah, and I'm thinking, we're talking about in obviously migration and immigration and refugee, they are separate things, and again they're meshed together, and we're having this conversation during Refugee Week in the UK, and I just also think about the lack of support and services available that acknowledge the things you've just talked about for immigrants as well. So again, if we go back to go get some counseling, go do this, if you have to spend the bulk of the time explaining that to someone, that's not going to be healing. If someone doesn't take into account your cultural references and that makes you have CBT, which is a very Eurocentric thing, how is that really going to help you recover from this ordeal?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. And like often these, like the immigration processes themselves are re-traumatizing. So like all the stuff we talked about before about understanding like these histories and understanding how this present is a product of some of those histories, it's like surely would be essential for anyone who was going to be supporting anyone who'd had to sort of is having to navigate this, or anyone who's had to move countries for whatever reason they've had to do. Like we just know the services are really threadbare. There's like loads of really amazing people out there doing that support work, but it's too few people. And one person I interviewed for the book who does at the time was doing this kind of like immigration advice work said like everyone burns out, and because there's so much need, the system is so complicated, and there's just so little funding, so few people. And like I remember him saying like again, it really feels like they design it to like, and obviously that's very difficult to sort of prove, but like his sort of view is that everything is such that it's all piled on top of like whether you're providing the support or whether you're on the end of like experiencing some of this. And obviously those two categories are not separate, people can be doing both. It's just so overwhelming for people, and yeah, it just doesn't feel like there's in any way enough support.
And then thinking about workplaces, and I think about the whole spectrum of workplaces, and often charities that workplaces will support, they might be tied to a particular month or event. So we're also in Pride Month at the moment. So people are quite happy, organizations, to change their logo to a Pride flag, or, during Women's History Month, put on events, but they can be for one strata of society. Breast cancer charities. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying that shouldn't be supported. That's great. But actually, if we're going to make some headway in this, people need to kind of have these conversations and understand the aspects that you picked up on, Maya. So what do you think workplaces should be doing to talk about this topic, open up the conversation so it's not seen as quote unquote too political, not for the workplace, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wish the starting point would be that actually to do nothing or to say nothing or to not allow like this discussion or to not like in some way try and address some of these things is itself like political. Like being silent on certain issues is a political choice. And I suppose it sort of depends on the workplace that we're thinking of, because some workplaces, I guess, are not so invested, or it wouldn't really work for there to be like thoroughgoing conversations around this, because then it would be, having conversations around why is it that like so many of the people, and I would like to think about like this is the case in universities as well, like so many of the people who clean the building are on such poor pay, are from marginalized communities or minoritized communities, or have insecure immigration status potentially. Like that is sort of, it's much easier for an organization to sort of show that it supports a certain cause than to actually reflect on who's doing what work within the building, if there is a building, and how that's commensurate, like what people's salaries are, whether those people are outsourced, who's not. And so I suppose my sort of like the way that I think we should think about these things is to start with the people who are the most marginalized in the organization. That should be your starting point to think about why that is, who that is, how you can change that. And then from there, like it is the sort of like that's not a new thought, obviously that's like been part of political organizing for decades, is that you center the most marginalized, and I think that should apply in like the workplace too. And like for me that is about thinking about how things like race and class, disability, sexuality, how these things all work together in order to sort of marginalize people, I guess. I mean, it's not I don't know that that's like such a like clear answer to your question, but I do think that for me, that is the thing that we should be thinking about, is who's in the room and who's being heard.
And I think this is the issue with often networks and things. They're great, but yeah, like you said, who's in the room? And, you know, I know organizations that set up senior women's network and you have to be a particular grade, and it's just people, you know, from the same background talking to themselves, and it's not really looking at, as you said, what's the marginalization on the ground and what are we going to do to change it? Because actually those things could be changed quite easily. Then it's not rocket science, as I always say. And so you mentioned burnout and people that work in this space burning out. And as a busy professional yourself, I'd really love to know how you look after your mental health while doing this work, and what are your top 3 tips?
Oh God. I now I'm gonna like expose myself as like the most awful cliche. So I think like for anyone, I suppose like one thing is to, depending on who you are, what you do, like I guess this differs, but like knowing that it's not you, I think for me is a sort of comforting place, like knowing that this is what work often does, and like there is like an exploitative relationship. That's what, like, if you think about how capitalism is structured, when, you know, talking about all the stuff around racial capitalism, obviously there's different degrees of that, but just one of the things that I guess provides me with some kind of sanity is just reminding myself, because I'm really someone as well who can get very caught up in like, must work all the hours in the day, must do everything and apply myself, and like sort of taking a step back and actually thinking once in a while, like, what is my life for? And obviously that's like a luxurious position to be in. That's not the case for everyone, depending on what your work is. But just even having that awareness that it's not in your head, it's not you, it's not that you're not doing enough. This is like how it's structured, is to sort of make you feel like that, is to take as much of your time away from you as possible. So that's, I guess, like a tip is just to sort of like think it in that way. I mean, for me, I like do the most cringe thing in the world, which is, and I did just get into this during the pandemic, so I'm just like basically a cliche Guardian reader, is I like got into open water swimming. And actually for me, that's just something I do that I really enjoy. It's like basically if you can find anything in your life where you if you can afford to do it, if it's free, or if there's like time to do it, those are all things that not everyone has, I know. But if you can like carve out that space to do that thing, like for me, just swimming, I can't look at my phone, I can't think about anything else. I'm just thinking about like, don't drown, don't freeze to death if it's cold. Like just for me, that's like that's just the thing that works really well. And yeah, I guess like trying to find, and I probably should have said this before the swimming thing if I'm doing it in order of like ranking, but never mind. Like trying to find people who are on the same page and want to fight for the same thing. So yeah, like burnout is real for me. In order to sort of like be able to get up in the morning, there has to be things that I am invested in trying to change things around me. And I wouldn't make any lofty claims about what I'm doing. There's way more people out there doing way more than I am, but like having people who are like on the same page, who want to fight for the same things, is one of the things that like keeps me going. Because otherwise I suppose with some of this like mental health stuff, there's like a route where it can become very just individualistic, and it really actually, the collective is where the joy and the change and the possibility is. And so I probably should have started with that actually if I was ranking, like finding that common space and finding that whatever that is that you want to like work together with other people to change, that is like where the like I think that the true sort of joy can come from.
Yeah, that's really good. And I don't think anyone said that. So just about, the collective, find people on the same page. And I don't think it's cliched about open water swimming. I think it's brilliant. I know lots of people do it, but I think it's really great.
Yeah, although now it's like all I feel like I talk about. It's really like a lifestyle thing. It's so bad. But it is also like, I think for me, actually that one, and this is sort of like on the individualistic thing, and I don't know if you have anything like this in your life, but like I'm someone who's quite cautious, and for me the open water swimming thing is something that I find quite scary. And so it is the sort of I don't know if you know, like the Wim Hof like sort of thinking. is like, again, I would prefer like the collective stuff and think about that, but obviously we also have to survive as like ourselves every once in a while. And so for me, it is like this thing that I fear, even, you know, I've been doing it for like now 2 years. In winter, I still fear it because I fear what could happen to me. And like the ability to overcome that and do it is like, there's something really like, there feels like there's power in that. So whatever that looks like for you, whatever that is like sort of pushing the boundaries a bit on like what's possible, I guess, without that sounding like too much of a sort of cliche individualism kind of live your best life thing. But for me, that sort of works in a way of like,
it's a survival mode though, isn't it? Like, and to remind yourself that I've been through some tough stuff and actually I can get through it because I can get through doing this. I can use that learning in the day-to-day. So no, I don't think it's living your best life. # open water swimming. So Maya, it's been brilliant to talk to you, and thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom. And if people want to know more about your work, how should they contact you?
So if people want to know more, they can, I've got Twitter, they can contact me on Twitter, or they can email me. I'm never opposed to hearing from people and like talking things through, or like chatting to people about their work if it's like on a similar sort of subject. Yeah, like you can Google me and my email address is publicly available at my Sheffield University email address. But yeah, always happy to hear from people who want to like discuss any of these things that we've talked about. And yeah, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for asking. I feel like the open water swimming thing, I like always think, should I say it? And then I always end up saying it, and then I always sort of regret saying it. But yeah, thanks for a good set of questions that I think I'll be thinking about like in the days to come.
No, thanks so much, everyone. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I will include your links in the show notes. And take care, everyone. And do tune in next week where we'll be talking about lived experiences and how they shape the world around us. Until next time, bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.